and.org.
This week on Lectures in History, Boston University professor Nina Silber and her class examine the roles and lives of women during the Civil War. They talk about the unique challenges female slaves faced and discuss Harriet Jacobs' book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Professor Silber also talks about reasons Southern white women would or would not have supported the Confederacy. Her class is an hour 15 minutes.
All right, so last week we started talking about the beginning of the movement for women's rights. As you know, we had our little debate. We talked about the Seneca Falls Convention. Black women, as I was saying at the very end of the class, were usually on the margins, I would say, of the women's rights movement. There were some exceptions. We talked about Sojourner Truth, who played a pretty important role in some of the early women's rights meetings. And Harriet Jacobs also had a close relationship with a number of women's rights activists. She worked with organizations that were involved in the struggle for women's rights during the Civil War, after the Civil War. But she was also very critical of white suffragists and often made the point that they did not fully recognize the way race had created, a kind of distinct set of obstacles for black women. And in fact, I think somebody in our debate made exactly that point at one point in our discussion. So we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. Now I want to talk about Jacobs herself, the narrative that she composed. I think, as you know, she wrote that narrative under the name of Linda Brent. She also changed the names of other people that were also in that account. She was born not as Linda Brent, but as Harriet Jacobs in Edenton, North Carolina in 1813. Her parents were slaves, but they were also, and I think you get a sense of this when she describes her childhood, her parents were skilled workers, which meant that they, especially her father, had the opportunity to hire out their time and also to live somewhat independently from the slaveholders. Her father was a carpenter. His independence meant that he could have his children live at home with him, his children being Harriet and her brother John, who is referred to as William in the narrative. And also residing close to them was Harriet's maternal grandmother. Her name was Molly Horniblow. I think what is she, Aunt Martha, I think, in the book. But her actual name was Molly Horniblow. She had a very kind of complicated history, Harriet's grandmother. She was freed during the Revolution. Then she was re-enslaved when she was captured during the Revolutionary War. So she was one of those, I think we talked about how during the American Revolution it was kind of some opportunities opened up for slaves to escape, to get their freedom. She was captured. She was re-enslaved eventually, and I think you get this bit of it in the book. She was freed again. When somebody bought her in the town and then freed her. Most of Harriet's experience as a slave, she is living in the town. There's a brief period when she's working on a plantation, but for the most part she's working in a household and not on a plantation. I don't know how to make this a sharper image. I guess I could try turning off the backlights. Does that help a little bit? So this is Harriet Jacobs in 1894. She's age 81. I really tried to find a picture of Harriet Jacobs when she was younger, but there does not seem to be one. The other thing you should know, too, is that, she's a slave in North Carolina, which had a somewhat different system from what existed in other parts of the South at this point. It was never a state that was dominated by large slave plantations. And then once we have this, what we've called the Second Middle Passage, right, which was this point after the foreign slave trade has ended and when slaves are being shipped from the seaboard south into the interior towards the Mississippi Valley to Mississippi, Louisiana. Once you have that Second Middle Passage, slaves are being taken precisely from places like North Carolina and moved to the west. And for the most part, not exclusively, but I would say there's really a premium placed on moving young men for that Second Middle Passage. And so it meant that, in the seaboard South, in places like North Carolina, there was a kind of predominance, really, of women, children, and the elderly in the slave community. The other thing I would say about slavery in North Carolina at this point is that even though there were not large plantations, there were ways in which North Carolina slaveholders were trying to make the system of slavery pay good dividends for them, even though, in a sense, the kind of whole system of slavery was moving westward. But in North Carolina, they were trying new tactics. They were letting slaves hire themselves out. They were sometimes letting slaves buy their own freedom. And so I think you get a sense of some flexibilities, perhaps, that existed for the slaves who lived around Harriet Jacobs at this time, at least compared to slaves who were living further to the west. So Harriet also points out that she became aware that she was a slave when she was 6 years old. I think this was right after her mother died. When she was 11, after her first slave mistress died, she then became a slave in the household of Dr. Flint. And Dr. Flint was the pseudonym for this man, James Norcom. This is James Norcom when he was a younger man. This is James Norcom when he looks sort of suitably devilish, I think, in this picture, so, as he should. This is James Norcom when he was an older man. And this is the Norcom house where Harriet Jacobs would have spent most of her time working in Edenton, North Carolina. So at 16, Harriet then began, as you can tell from the account, she began this sexual relationship with the son of Dr. Norcom's partner. I actually didn't know that until I read more about it. The son of Dr. Norcom's partner, who was a 30-year-old man named Samuel Sawyer. He is Mr. Sands in the book. I don't have a picture of him. I'm sorry. I looked everywhere. And she had by Sawyer 2 children. These are believed to be pictures of Harriet Jacobs' children. Her daughter, Louisa, and then her son, Joseph. And so then in the book, of course, this is Benjamin and Ellen. Those are the names that they're given in the narrative. When she was 22 in 1835, Jacobs escaped from the Norcom plantation, right? So she had been kind of reassigned at that point to the plantation, and at that point she began her stay in the crawl space in her grandmother's attic. The dimensions of this crawl space, I don't remember if she gives it in the book, but the dimensions of that crawl space were 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and about 3 feet high at one end. So I think she says, when she's in the crawl space, for the most part, she can't stand up straight. After she spends 7 years in the crawl space, she managed then a successful escape to the north. So here then is a kind of overview of Harriet Jacobs' grandmother's house, which you can see is actually, a somewhat substantial house for this time. And then that's a kind of cutaway of the crawl space where Harriet Jacobs would have stayed. And then this is I think Harriet Jacobs mentions this is the runaway slave notice that Norcom, or Flint, placed after Harriet Jacobs had escaped from the plantation. She's in the crawl space at this point. He doesn't know where she is, right? But so this is the runaway notice that he placed, and you can see on the bottom it's signed by James Norcom, Edenton, North Carolina. I think it's 1835 on that. So when she got to the North, Harriet Jacobs became very active in abolitionism. She was befriended by several white women who were abolitionists. They gave her aid and support. They heard about her story. They encouraged her to write her story in the form of a narrative. She finished writing it in 1858. It's not a novel. Sometimes people call all of these kinds of books novels. It's not a novel. It's nonfiction. She wasn't able to secure a publisher until one of her white abolitionist friends, and that was Lydia Maria Child, wrote the preface for the book and sort of gave it her endorsement, which was kind of typical, among slaves. People said, oh, well, you write so well. How could you have been a slave? You speak so well. How could you have been a slave? And so Lydia Maria Child gave this kind of endorsement to say, that this was really a true story about Harriet Jacobs. And so it was published then in 1861 on the eve of the Civil War. And it's one of the few, not the only and not even the first, but one of the few slave narratives that was written by a woman. Most of the ones that we're familiar with, that we've come across, that have been published, were narratives that were written by male slaves. They, wrote about their confrontations with slave masters, their, quest for freedom as a kind of individual activity. Have any of you read like Frederick Douglass or any other slave narratives? I'm seeing one. So we'll talk a little bit about sort of what the difference is between Harriet Jacobs and the other kinds of slave narratives written by men. So anybody have any initial thoughts about this book? Any comments they want to make? Things that surprised you or sort of stood out for you as you were reading this account? Yes.
I think I was surprised by all the time she sort of apologized for what she was doing. I think when she had her children and she just she kept trying to explain herself and make us understand why she would do it when I really didn't feel like I wasn't.
You didn't feel like it was necessary to go through all that explaining, but she had to stop. Why do you think she is doing that? Any thoughts?
I guess just her whole life she was made to apologize to people for what she was doing, so maybe that's just how she is.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Like why she keeps apologizing? Yeah.
I would also say that if one of the primary factors in her writing the book is to appeal to white Northerners, that she'll want to make sure there aren't any loopholes or places that they can pick apart at her story and go, well, why did you do that? So just taking great pains to explain everything.
Right, so I think a big part of it has to do with the audience that she writes for and what she thinks they're going to think of her if she doesn't make those apologies. Yeah. Anything else that stood out for you as you read it? Things that were surprising, things that were kind of, unusual about the way she described her situation? Yeah.
I liked how Dr. Flint, or
you can call him Flint. That's what we know him as. Yeah, that's what we know him and hate him as.
He was scared of the grandmother because the grandmother had such a good reputation in the town that other people would look down on him.
Yes,
he yelled at her or anything.
Yeah, it is actually kind of amazing. I mean, the way, and you're right. It's interesting the way Flint is afraid of her. She's kind of an amazing woman too. That grandmother. I mean, you're right. She kind of commands respect. People, see her as an important person in the town. They like her baking, but she's also kind of developed a relationship with a lot of people. And you're really right about that. One of the most interesting stories, I think, is when he says he's going to sell her, and she says, well, but I've always been promised that I'd get my freedom, and he says, well, I'm going to sell you. I don't care what everybody says, and she goes to the slave auction, and then she gets right up there on the auction block, and everybody says, oh, that's horrible. That's such a shame. Nobody should be selling you, Aunt Martha. And then, this woman comes along and buys her and frees her. So she is kind of, she's kind of using the fact that people respect her and know her to kind of, to the extent that it's a power play. It's a little bit of a power play that she does against Dr. Flint. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is an interesting part. Yeah.
I think it was surprising how mistresses were the slaves, because you would think that since they're free women they really wouldn't care about the slaves, but how Harriet said that she would wake up in the middle of the night to her mistress tapping on her or whispering I wouldn't want to say sexual things, but whispering things that maybe the slave master would tell her to see if she would respond to it, to see if she was having an affair with the master.
Yes.
So
you're right. It is that relationship between Mrs. Flint and Harriet is really interesting, and you feel like this is a very sort of angry, frustrated woman who doesn't know what to do. Right? She feels like she's been cheated, she's been betrayed, And it's almost like, she doesn't have any power to do anything against her husband, so the only person she thinks that she has power over is Harriet Jacobs. But yeah, it is very interesting. So we sort of touched on this already, but one of the points I want to kind of pull out here a little bit more is what makes, from the standpoint of being a woman in slavery, a female slave, what makes Harriet Jacobs' experiences distinctive? So how would you what stands out as things that separate her from male slaves? Okay, people have to have things to say about this. Yeah, Savannah.
I think a large portion of her story is that she was constantly torn between wanting her own freedom and wanting to be a good mother for her children.
Okay. So motherhood and the ties that she has to her children are definitely an issue here. What else? What else stands out in her experience specifically as a female slave? Ellen?
I think a lot of the slaves depended on religion as a comfort, and it was very, very important to them, and her religion was sort of threatened in that she was constantly facing the threat of being sexually abused by the master, and then she was even forced to go back against her moral and religious principles to avoid being abused by him, and she went and had relations with the other man, Mr. Sands.
Mr. Sands, right.
And so, yeah, there was a facing of sexual abuse that really threatened her religious principles.
So she's trying to kind of balance or, deal with this issue of, there's sort of the whole question of the morality, the Christianity that's connected to it, and this constant threat that she's facing in terms of sexual abuse, and how's she going to manage that? So she says, just to kind of refer you to a couple of places, she's sort of very conscious that she has particular concerns that confront her as a slave who's a woman. She says on page 58, for example, this is the bottom of that first paragraph. She says, the influence of slavery had the same effect on me that they had on other young girls. They made me prematurely knowing concerning the evil ways of the world. I knew what I did, and I did it with deliberate calculation. And then she says again on page 85, and this is when she has given birth to her second child, and she finds out that it's a girl. And she says, when they told me my newborn baby was a girl, my heart was heavier than it had ever been before. Slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women. Super added to the burden common to all, they have wrongs and sufferings and mortifications peculiarly their own. So right, and I think these are some of the distinctive wrongs and sufferings that they encounter in terms of the constant threat of sexual abuse, the question of how to be a mother, and the sort of constant fear as a mother that slave women have for their children, what's going to happen to their children, how do they protect their children. How, in fact, in a very specific way, how does motherhood complicate Harriet Jacobs' plan for escape? What is her plan for escape? Does she just get on a boat right away and leave? No. What does she do? Yeah, what does she do?
Well, in order to secure her own freedom, she wants to secure her children's freedom first to make sure that if she can go up to the north, then her children can go up to the north with her. So she has the responsibility of securing three people's freedom.
Yes, right. She's worried not only about her own freedom, but she's worried about what's going to happen to her children as well. So what does she do? What does she do to kind of try to manage that problem of her children's freedom as well? Yeah.
Even as she's on the run, she tries to talk to Mr. Sands to make sure that he will buy the children and free them.
Right, okay, so she's constantly in negotiation with the children's father to see if she can get, some help and support from him. She goes, in fact, the whole 7 years in the crawl space is really all about protecting her children. Right? The 7 years in the crawl space, she calls it, she says it's her loophole. Right? Doesn't she call it her loophole of retreat or something like that? Page 128, right, the title of that chapter, The Loophole of Retreat, right, which sort of underscores this dilemma that she has as a female slave, which is she's going to try and exploit a loophole right here. She's going to make it look like she's gone, but in fact she's not really gone. So instead of, completely taking herself out of the community, she's going to be in a place where she can watch, where she can sort of, have some kind of supervision, even indirectly, over what happens to her children, where she hopes she can intervene in their situation. So can you imagine a male slave pursuing these kinds of strategies? What do men do? Like, how do they sort of approach the whole, if a slave who is a man, what's their escape plan, basically?
He wouldn't feel to have as many ties to where he was, so he could just go up to the north by himself.
At least that, yes, yeah. You're absolutely right. And I guess the only thing I would add to that is at least that's the way he would portray it. That he doesn't have ties, he's not bound by any other commitments, relationships, and that he's simply going to pursue a strategy on his own. One of the things to me that's so interesting about Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, and he also kind of goes through this was my experience, and then I ran away, and he does make it seem like he did the whole thing on his own, In fact, if you know a little bit more about Frederick Douglass, you'd find out, he got help from relatives, from his fiancée. There are a lot of people who were actually instrumental in the process. But there is a way in which men who are slaves sort of portray an experience that says they did it on their own. And women, like Harriet Jacobs, emphasizes these relationships. All right, so let me get a little more specific about this. There are 3 themes that I think are very important in understanding Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative. And the first theme is pretty much what we talked about, which is that her experience is unique because she writes as a slave woman. And so in that sense, she has certain kinds of experiences that are different from the kinds of experiences that men have. She has different experiences in slavery as a woman in terms of the threats of sexual abuse that she faces, in terms of how to deal with being a mother and protecting her children, and she has unique circumstances in terms of how she's going to pursue her freedom. The second theme that I think is important comes up in terms of how she tells the story. And when it comes to telling the story, I think she faces 2 choices. She kind of does a combination of both, I think, but there are sort of 2 strategies that are sort of the predominant writing strategies of that time that she could pursue. One is she could write along the lines of a male slave narrative, so something like Frederick Douglass wrote when he came to the North. Or she could write in the tradition of a sentimental novel. Which we talked a little bit about, but we'll come back to. And the third theme that I think is important here is that, stemming from this second one, one reason why I think she feels the need or is influenced by this model of this sentimental novel is because she's trying to appeal to a very specific audience. And we talked, in fact, Erin, in fact, I think you made this point. So who is that specific audience that she's trying to appeal to?
I guess white people in the North who may already have abolitionist leanings, but she feels aren't doing enough to stop it, or trying to create sympathy in people who aren't really addressing the issue at all.
Right, so she's writing for northern white, probably abolitionist leaning people, or, kind of vaguely anti-slavery, and even more, I think she's writing to northern white women, right? So then, in fact, there's a couple of points in the book where she says very explicitly, this is who I'm writing to, on page 58. And she's talking about, this was right after the other quote that I read to you about how slave girls, have these influences that can, be destructive of their morals. And right after that, she says on page 58, "But oh, ye happy women, whose purity has been sheltered from childhood, who have been free to choose the objects of your affection, whose homes are protected by law, do not judge the poor, desolate slave girl too severely." Right? This is a kind of direct appeal she's making to women, white women in the North. On page 60, she has again a part where she talks about this. In the middle of the page, she says, "Pity me and pardon me, O virtuous reader. You never knew what it is to be a slave, to be entirely unprotected by the law or custom." And there's other parts, too, where, she makes it very clear that that is the audience that she's interested in and that she's appealing to. And I would say even more, there's probably a kind of suspicion on her part that those northern white female readers are, even if she doesn't say this explicitly, are influenced by the idea that we've talked about of feminine difference, right? That these are women who feel like women's moral goodness, women's moral virtue are especially important qualities for women to have and to cultivate. And so I think she sort of suspects that these are women who put a very high premium on that, which is why, to get back to the first point, she's apologizing so much. Okay, so just to kind of pursue then, I think we talked quite a bit about one, but in terms of two, the sort of different options she has in terms of how she's going to write about her experience and whether she's going to follow the male slave narrative or whether she's going to follow the sentimental novel. So if you've anybody read anything else about slave narratives by men? Okay, Erin, maybe this is all going to fall on you, but maybe somebody else has also. But, so for example, like Frederick Douglass, how you might compare Harriet Jacobs' account to things that happened to Frederick Douglass. Like if you can sort of remember.
It was
a while
years ago. But I don't think he placed as much emphasis on like the female aspect of it for obvious reasons. There were a lot of things that stood out to me about what she had to say about white women as well, and the effect it had on them, and he wouldn't have had the same insight there. Mm-hmm. But I don't remember.
You don't remember the
That was middle school.
Yeah, I've only read pieces of Frederick Douglass's, but what I remember is that he makes it more of an account, or like, I think hers more reads like a diary where it pulls out your emotions, and his is just like, I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, and that's how I got to this.
Yeah.
It's more of like
there's less of a kind of emotional quality to it. Right, and if you remember, so there's sort of some kind of key moments in Frederick Douglass's narrative. Like one really critical moment is when he has a fight with this guy who's trying to break him in, a white slaveholder or something, who's trying to break him in and make him a more kind of obedient slave. And he has a fight with this guy, and he wins the fight, he beats him up, and he sort of says, this is a moment when I started to feel that I was a man and that I, could attain my freedom. So there are these kinds of moments, I think, in male slave narratives. And again, it sort of puts this emphasis on doing it yourself, kind of struggling as an individual, achieving things as an individual. These were kind of the important markers in the male slave narrative. And I think in a more general way, the whole movement about abolitionism emphasized freedom, being free, as kind of a male experience, right? That in other words, the kind of relationship people understood was once you were free and not a slave anymore, you were a man. Like they wouldn't have said, once you're free and not a slave anymore, you're a woman. You know what I mean? Being a man was critical. For example, this was sort of one of the chief symbols that was used in the abolitionist movement. And it was sort of this decal. I think it was made by Wedgwood in England, the pottery firm in England. But this was a widely circulated image in the abolitionist movement. And if you could, can you read what it says around the...
Am I not a man and a brother?
Right. So this was the trope, really, of the abolitionist movement. Am I not a man and a brother? So sort of the juxtaposition here is either you're a slave or you're a man, which makes it hard if you're a woman. It makes it hard to know how do you write about your experience and how do you write about achieving freedom. And I think Harriet Jacobs is very aware of this. So there's points in the course of her narrative where she makes some reference to the genre of a male slave narrative, of trying to this juxtaposition of if you're not a slave, you're going to be a man. Can you think of any parts in the book where she might be saying something, sort of referencing this idea of being a man? Yeah.
At one point, she's talking about how her brother was really prideful and not used to having to respond to a master and wouldn't be submissive enough because he was a man and was afflicted by his male urges and things.
Right. She definitely uses it to talk about her brother. There's a part where, can anybody think of any other parts? Because there's also a part, I think, where she's talking about her uncle, maybe? Let me check. It's chapter 4. It's wherever chapter 4 begins on page 14. The title of the chapter, The Slave Who Dared to Feel Like a Man. Right, which I think, in fact, right, this is a whole discussion about her uncle Benjamin, and she sort of talks about his quest for freedom. And she writes it in this kind of form of the male slave narrative, the slave who dared to feel like a man. But I think there's also ways in which Harriet Jacobs herself takes on some of these kind of masculine qualities because she knows this is the way the struggle for freedom has been phrased, right? That this is the way people talk about being a slave who seeks their freedom. You sort of present it as being a man. And so, in fact, on page 16, also in chapter 4, she says... Right, and this is sort of on the bottom, and again, it's sort of in reference to the experience of her uncle. She says, and then she talks about herself, she says, it was the very knowledge of my own shortcomings that urged me to retain, if possible, okay, actually this part is about her brother, to retain, if possible, some sparks of my brother's God-given nature. So in other words, she wants to kind of take on some of those masculine qualities herself because that's what this quest for freedom is about. Okay, so the other part of point 2 here is that she's sort of torn between these two ways of presenting her story. One being the male slave narrative and the other, the sentimental novel. All right, we have talked briefly about this idea of the sentimental novel. What have we said about it? Anybody remember? All right, I'll help you out here. So I think one of the things we said was that it puts a lot of emphasis on feelings, on emotions. We've seen that here, right? That's sort of one of the things that Harriet Jacobs emphasizes quite a bit. The sentimental novel also, the kind of formula, I would say, for the sentimental novel was it kind of told the story of a virtuous Christian heroine who, has all of these kind of challenges in her life and adverse circumstances, but nonetheless, through it all, despite all the kind of threats that are made against her, she manages to retain her virtue over evil practicing men, right? And in the end, the way that the sentimental novel concludes is that she finds a romantic partner and she marries him. Okay, obviously Harriet Jacobs, her story does not lend itself completely to this genre because she doesn't retain her virtue. But I think she tries to manage the problem of her virtue and her sexuality because she is in some ways influenced by that genre of the sentimental novel. Can you think of ways in which she tries to somehow explain and manage that problem of her virtue, which again gets back to that first point that she's constantly apologizing. Like, maybe think about the way she's kind of making her apologies or the way she's trying to explain herself.
Well, she says that, like, if she didn't have children with Mr. Sands, then her other slave owner, Dr. Flint, wouldn't want to sexually abuse her anymore, so then it would take her out of the equation completely.
Right, so if she does enter this relationship with Sands, then she thinks that won't be bothered so much by Flint, right?
Yeah, and then she says that Dr. Sands or Mr. Sands can buy her children's freedom, so it like works as like a double-edged sword.
Right, so she's sort of saying, yes, I know, I gave myself, right? That's where she has that whole long thing about, yes, I made this horrible thing, don't judge me, you happy free women, blah, 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 blah. And that's when she says, but I made this choice to go with Mr. Sands because that would at least be, it would be a way that I could control what happens to my children. She says, it sort of gave me a little measure of freedom to make that choice. And I think she also says, part of what she also tries to explain at this point, and I think there's also a part about this on page 58. Right, well, it's in some ways the quote that I read to you before, when she says, the real source of the problem, the reason I didn't retain my virtue, the reason I went with Sands, was because of slavery. Right, it's not my fault as a woman. It wasn't that I have some moral failing as a woman. I know precisely what's correct and what's not correct, but the problem was slavery. So she, tries to make it clear that that's the thing that corrupts a young girl's moral situation. She also, I think, then tries to redefine what it means to be free. She says at one point on page 59, when she makes this decision about picking Mr. Sands, she says it seems less degrading to give one's self than to submit to compulsion. There is something akin to freedom in having a lover who has no control over you except that which he gains by kindness and attachment. So let's actually talk for a minute about this whole business with Sands. Do you think that was a choice that she had? Would you call that a moment of choice for Harriet Jacobs?
I think it was a moment of relative choice, like more so than in other situations in her life, but it was really just picking the lesser of two evils. Nothing was really good or free. She had to make a tough decision.
Mm-hmm. So it doesn't feel like a wide open choice there. Yeah.
I think choice kind of implies that she's free, which she's not. So I don't think that it was a choice at all. Like
right.
That's not a choice of freedom. Like she wasn't free when she made that choice. So I don't think that it was a choice.
Right.
I think she just
because the decision that she made was sort of shaped by the fact that she's a slave.
Yeah.
In other words.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So, and here's this thing that I read later, which I thought was so interesting. This is actually another historian who's writing about Harriet Jacobs' situation and sort of had a very interesting insight about it. So she says, Norcom's threats, or Dr. Flint's threats, and Harriet's distress alerted Norcom's partner's son, the unmarried young lawyer Samuel Treadwell Sawyer, that is Sands, to her sexual availability and made her quarry. He began at that point courting her through letters and other expressions of sympathy. Caught between two older stalkers, Harriet gave in to the younger evil. So in other words, this analysis, which seems very, very, very kind of interesting way, which I hadn't really thought about, because she doesn't explain it this way in the book. Here's Sands, or Sawyer, who knows Harriet. I mean, it's a small town. Everybody knows everybody else. He's actually the son of Flint's partner. He knows very well what's going on between Flint and Harriet, and he knows Harriet is trying to get away from Flint, so he's like, hey, here's an opportunity for me. I'm going to introduce myself to Harriet. I'm going to be friends with Harriet. So, she says he's actually sort of playing this situation, knowing full well the kind of distress that Harriet's in at that point. So to the extent that you might think, oh, maybe he's kind of a nice guy, Well, I don't know. By the time it's over, who would think he's a nice guy? Because he doesn't give the children their freedom. So until he's badgered to death about doing it. So, I think it sort of goes to this point that how much choice really is there for Harriet Jacobs at this point? Okay, so at the very end of the book, just to kind of conclude this point about these different genres that Harriet Jacobs writes in response to or tries to fit her narrative into, at the very end, she confronts outright the fact that she is not writing a sentimental novel. Do you remember what she says at the very end? I'll give you a hint. It's on page 227. Bless you. Bless us. Bless us all. Exactly.
She says, Rita, my story ends with freedom, not in the usual way with marriage, but with like being free instead of...
Exactly.
Yeah.
My story ends with freedom, not in the usual way with marriage. In other words, the usual way here is the sentimental novel. The usual way an account like this might end is the virtuous heroine goes through all these ordeals, and in the end she finds, the man she truly loves, and she marries and settles down. But she says, I'm not going to end this way. This book doesn't end this way. But it ends, and maybe, she's sort of saying, maybe it ends in a more important way. It ends with freedom and not with marriage. Okay, so I'm going to throw out one other point here, and maybe I'll have time for something else too, which is there are some interpretations that I have read in which people say that, in fact, Harriet Jacobs was not successfully able to resist the threats and sexual abuse of Dr. Flint, and that he did, in fact, rape her, but that a sense of propriety compels her to tell the story in a different kind of way. What do you think about that? Like, did you read this book and you think, oh yeah, I'm sure he did?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It seems really unrealistic to me that he would go through all of the notes and that Mrs. Flint would be so upset about it if it never physically escalated to that point.
Yeah, the only thing I could think of is that he was so afraid of the grandmother and that's why he wouldn't do it. But besides that, it seems like he probably did.
Yeah.
Where she is so apologetic throughout it, I would understand where she's coming from if she did just leave that out. Because she has all this pressure, especially if she does want to appeal to those northern white women, where she doesn't want to make it seem like it looks bad on her almost.
Right. So in other words, it's totally plausible that it would happen, but you could see why she has to present it differently. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think, I suppose another way of saying this is, given what she describes, it feels like a pretty escalated version of sexual abuse, no matter what we call this, right? That he throws her down the stairs, that all the kind of, in a sense, physical abuse that she actually does endure, almost like it's a gray area in terms of what we would actually call it. Okay, I'm going to move on to something else. And we're going to sort of switch gears here and talk about the coming of the Civil War. As I mentioned, Harriet Jacobs' narrative is published right on the eve of the Civil War in 1861. So I feel like chronologically, at least we've kind of got to that point, so it makes sense to move on to that next topic. At the time of the Civil War, I would say most people knew that slavery, without question, slavery had something to do with causing the Civil War. And somehow or other, people knew that the war was linked to the struggle for abolition. And in fact, the story was often told that sometime in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, who was then the president, met the famous woman writer, Harriet Beecher Stowe. We've talked about Stowe and her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which took the country by storm in the 1850s. And according to this story, which I don't think is actually true, but it's a story that a lot of people like to tell, Lincoln greeted Harriet Beecher Stowe by referring to her as, quote, the little lady who wrote the book that started this great war. I have to say, I've always been a little confused about that. It was like, is that a compliment to Harriet Beecher Stowe? Like, do you feel good if you're Harriet Beecher Stowe? Yes. Oh, thank you. Yes, I'm the one. I did that. Yes, it's all my fault. I don't think that that's really the way the story is presented. It's meant to be more like how influential Harriet Beecher Stowe was. And whether or not Lincoln actually said this, I think there is a reason why Lincoln might have said it. Because when you put things like this, here's the lady who wrote the book that started this great war, it implied that the Union cause had a standing and moral credibility. And it had that kind of standing and moral credibility because here was a woman like Harriet Beecher Stowe who'd kind of put her stamp on it, right? Who'd said, this is what it's all about. And if we can refer back to this woman's concern, then it gives our cause moral credibility. By 1863, Lincoln, of course, was now pursuing a policy of emancipation to end slavery. He himself was trying to put the war on a higher moral foundation. And so I think it makes sense that he would in some way try to draw on the endorsement of somebody like Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, in the South, white Southerners did something similar, although obviously they were not putting the same emphasis on emancipation. They portrayed Southern white women as the source of moral inspiration for their cause, for the Confederacy. They even made the argument that they were fighting the war in the first place to protect their women, obviously in this case, white women. But if we look at the situation more closely, I think we can also see some very interesting and important points of contrast between North and South and the way they thought about women and the way they thought about gender. And here's where I think the important difference is. The Confederates, more than Union supporters, tended to downplay women's direct involvement in the war. They tended to try to, yes, women were important, women were, kind of part of our moral foundation, but in terms of their direct participation in the war, Confederates said, no, not so important. Small, totally unimportant role for women. And I think it came from a tradition in the South of seeing women protected, of seeing women sheltered. Even if they didn't really do all these things, they liked to believe that they were doing things. We talked about that idea of sort of putting women on a pedestal. I think this sort of comes across here. And as a result, it meant that women, white women who lived in the Confederacy, were much more limited and constrained in terms of what kind of involvement and participation they could have in the war effort. A case in point here, although not really historically accurate, would be Gone with the Wind. Okay, anybody know Gone with the Wind? I'm going to get a few more hands this time, I hope, right? Gone with the Wind. You read the book? No, nobody reads the book. Anybody read that book? No, because it's 1,000 pages. Why would you bother? But why would you see that film? It's 4.5 hours. All right, but somebody's seen it. All right, who's the central character? Yes, we could all say it in unison. Scarlett O'Hara. Okay, so Scarlett O'Hara is actually constantly, in some ways, confronting this problem. And in fact, ways, it's one of the central tensions of her story in this book, that she's constantly confronting the kind of limits that Southern society places on women. She can't run a business. She wants to be flirtatious. She wants to actually have more kind of sexuality. Her society says, no, women don't do this kind of thing. And during the war, in fact, there's one scene when, she goes to a fundraising fair, and all she can do really is just kind of sit behind the table at this fair, and people say, that's it. We can't allow women to do any more than that because it would be unseemly. Well, and especially unseemly for Scarlett at that point because I think she was a widow, so even more so. All right. So what I want to do then is compare and talk about some of the different ways that women figured into the war effort. And also the way the causes were being defined in both the North and in the South. And so how both sides were kind of putting women into the picture, when they talked about the reasons that they were fighting, but then they also talked about the things, or the way they talked about the things that women actually did in the course of the war. All right, so here's the first point I want to make. To understand the roles and the expectations in terms of Southern women and Northern women in the war, we have to go back and connect that to a thing that we've been talking about already for the past few weeks in terms of either the separate spheres in the North or that other thing in the South. Anybody remember what I called it?
The civic sphere? No.
The civic sphere was the third sphere, but we talked about the patriarchal household economy in the South. So sort of these two different ways of thinking about gender roles in the North and the South. And so, in fact, understanding the basic division of war between the North and the South is very much connected to understanding something about gender. Now, as we know, historians have all kinds of debates and discussions. Is a war caused by slavery? Is a war caused by states' rights? Blah, blah, all constitutional principles. And my point is not, I don't really care about that, or it's not about slavery. But my point is that we can't really understand the different ways the two sides conceived of their causes, kind of formulated their differences without understanding gender. So let me get more specific about what I mean. In the South, I believe that Southern white men went to war. Yes, they went to war for slavery. But another way to talk about this is that they went to war. I have so little blackboard space. They went to war for something we should call mastery. And what I mean by that is that they went to war to fight for their right to be independent, land-holding men who controlled and ran their own households as they saw fit. I'll say that again. They fought for the right to be independent, land-holding men who controlled and ran their own households as they saw fit. For many of them, this meant the right to control, buy, sell their black slaves. Or perhaps for many of them, even more of them, it meant to someday themselves be masters over black slaves. But in a more general sense, it meant the power over their own household. To run their own household and rejecting the idea that a government can kind of come in and mess with your household, right? That a government has a right to kind of intervene in any way in what happens in your home. And I think this language, or this mentality, was reflected in the language that Southern white men used when they went to war. Because what they talked about, if you listen to things that soldiers wrote about or even some politicians wrote about, it wasn't like sort of a very abstract principle or some kind of abstract national idea, but they wrote about preserving and protecting their home. A soldier from Virginia, for example, said, quote, "The man who loves his family the best now is he who is the most anxious and will risk the most and suffer the most to repel the invader." Another soldier said it this way, "Dear is my country to me, yet dearer far is the treasure I have in my little woman." Right? So in other words, what's most important here? Family, your home, your kind of domestic space, this household. Now, obviously, one thing that's going on here is that here's the people that were being attacked, they were being invaded, and they saw their fight as something that was close to home, right? The home had to be protected. But I also think there's something else going on in this language, because they were fighting, in a sense, to retain this position as the protectors and patriarchs of their household. And they were fighting to retain that position because that was the source of all their power and their wealth. It was the place that kind of, encapsulated all their worldly assets. We are fighting for matters real and tangible, said one soldier from Texas, our property and our homes. Right? So in other words, they're really, to a great extent, not messing this up with some, we want a nation, we want a country. They're very much talking about homes and families. Now, these might seem like words that men use a lot when they go to war. And yes, to some extent, that's true. These are things that men often say when they go to war. But what's striking, I think, is that there was, in fact, a very different kind of language that men in the North used when they went to war. Because Union soldiers repeatedly separated the idea of a home from country or nation, and they tended to put the nation above the home. They tended to say the most important thing that we are fighting for, not homes, families, etc., but this national ideal. So, one soldier said, for example, to his wife, "My duties to my country are of more importance now than my duty to you." Thank you, buddy, yeah. Another one wrote, "Duty prompts me to go, my country first, home and friends next." Right, so they're very kind of, we've got priorities, and the most important thing now is the nation. Now, geographically speaking, in terms of how the war was fought, again, that makes sense. These were men who were not staying in place and protecting their home the way Southerners might have been. They were going off. They were going away. They were going to a far-off region. Admittedly, yes, a place that seemed to be sort of part of their country, but it was far off nonetheless. And so they put a lot of emphasis on that idea of the country. But again, there was also something else going on here, because I think it was easier for Union soldiers to deprioritize, is that a word? Give less priority to their home because it wasn't their domain. Not in the way that it was for Confederate soldiers. So again, remember we had that whole, that very complicated diagram about the separate spheres. In the North, right, we have home, work. In the South, we have the one big sphere of the kind of plantation household with a home sphere in the middle. So in other words, following this notion that the home was really a kind of distinct separate sphere where women were more or less in charge, it meant that men sort of thought, okay, that's really a secondary consideration for me. Northern men would have said that. Northern men, additionally, did not usually have all their wealth and property concentrated in their home in the same way that Southern men did. Right? Because we know Northern men increasingly were looking outside the home to factories, to businesses, to the marketplace as a source of wealth. And so it meant that it was easier for Northern men to say the most important thing is country, the less important thing is the home. Or, as one Union soldier put it when he went off to fight, first my God, second my country, third my mother. Again, really? All right, so if you were in the South, it would have been inconceivable to rank your mother so low. That was not the language that Southern men used when they went off to war. One Southerner, in fact, wrote, quote, "The mere mention of Southern womanhood was enough to send strong men into tears or shouts. I verily believe the ranks of the Confederacy went rolling into battle in the misty conviction that it was wholly for her that they fought." Right? So these two different conceptions, this kind of, woman as central, the home and family as central versus, country is really more important than home. These two different ways of talking about the cause had important effects on women. The women who heard these conceptions, the women who had to live through this and deal with these ideas that were being put forth as the war began. So, imagine... Let's put on our imagination caps here for a minute. Let's take a moment and imagine you are a Southern white woman at the beginning of the Civil War. And suddenly you are hearing things like what I just read. that the mere mention of Southern womanhood was enough to send strong men into tears. I believe the ranks of the Confederacy went rolling into battle in the misty conviction that it was wholly for her they fought. You are hearing this like, how central you are to this momentous struggle. So, what do you feel? What is it going to make you want to do?
Makes you want to back the Confederacy and preserve this way of life.
Okay, so it's definitely a way of kind of drawing you into the concerns of the Confederacy. You want to support the Confederacy. How could you not want to support the Confederacy? Because they're supporting. So you feel it definitely gives you that sense of attachment.
Also like to get involved in whatever war efforts like women were allowed to be involved in at the time, because I know in the American Revolution we talked about how they really like could only voice their political opinions in like negative ways, like in protests or like just adding into like a boycott. Mm-hmm. But I mean, like obviously like times had changed even slightly, but like just involving themselves in any ways that they kind of could.
Okay, right. So that they feel the cause is important. They feel that they are important themselves to the cause. You're right, and I think there's a strong sense of how do we contribute? How do we do something for this cause? Anything else?
Mm-hmm. Well, it actually allowed the women's sphere to expand slightly, because to get involved in the war efforts in ways of running fundraisers and also especially nursing in war hospitals, women had to leave their homes and be active in the community.
Okay, so these are things, we don't know yet how that's going to develop, but yes, you're right, that these are things that they might be looking for. These might be ways that, you might want to get involved to kind of push outside of that sphere. Absolutely. So yes, so right. So Southern women, certainly there's a sense of their kind of importance to the cause and to the whole struggle that the Confederacy is waging. This is an illustration. It says on the bottom, Southern women hounding their men onto rebellion, right? So this is sort of just to kind of conveys that sense that, who's really the instigators here? Who's really kind of promoting this? It's women. Right? In fact, the men here are kind of don't look that happy about it. The men are like, really? I have to go to war? I'm not sure. Well, some of them look like they're ready to do that. But the ones who really seem to be egging on the conflict, at least in this illustration, are Southern women. And so, yes, I think there's a sense that they want to be involved, that it's important. They start writing inspirational poetry to inspire men to go to war. They're going to find ways to encourage men so that they can, make this sacrifice for the Confederacy. But they also feel frustrated. They feel a sense of frustration. And so that's sort of this point, like, I think they're going to try and find ways that they can be involved, but they're also going to run into limits in terms of how involved they can be. So they are, on the one hand, being told, yes, you're very important, you're kind of central to what this whole cause is about, but then what they face is this problem of how much they, as Southern white women, can really do in this war. They can write poems. Yes, they can. They're told that they should write letters to be very encouraging to men. They are told, for example, that only a woman can make, quote, the Confederate soldier a gentleman of honor, courage, virtue, and truth, instead of a cutthroat and vagabond. All right, but how do you do that? That's a kind of lofty goal, and it's kind of it's sort of almost passive. How do you actually play an active part in the role? And so a lot of Southern white women expressed frustration. There's sort of a very predominant note of frustration that comes from many Southern white women. Yes, we want to be active. Yes, we want to be involved. But we don't know what outlets there are for us to do that. If only, says one Southern girl, if only I could be of some use to our poor, stricken country. And many girls and women then would go on to say, I wish I were a man. This was a kind of constant refrain that many Southern women wrote. I wish I were a man, because if I was a man, it would be clear what I need to do. Men have very clear responsibilities in wartime. They have a definite field in which they can apply themselves. For women, it's much less clear. And so for a few women, the desire to be a man again, not unlike the American Revolution, but perhaps even more so in the Civil War, the desire to be a man translated into actually doing the work that men did, which is to become soldiers. So, the estimates, official figures, are about 400 women in both the North and the South disguised themselves as men. In some cases, they had gone initially to accompany their husbands. In some cases, they might have signed up to be nurses, and then they took the part of a man when they fell in battle. But some of them disguised themselves from the get-go and started out and joined the ranks as a man. People believe many more than 400 disguised themselves, but only 400 known cases because only 400 were discovered. So here, for example, is Loretta Janetta Velasquez. She was born in Cuba. She attended school in New Orleans. She eloped at age 14 with a Texas Army officer. And although her husband objected, she disguised herself as a man. So there she is in both of her guises. She disguised herself as a man and joined the Confederate Army. A few Southern women, white women, also became spies. Now, the thing about being a spy is that what many of them found was that they did not have to disguise their sex or hide their sex when they became a spy. They could, in fact, use their sex because they could cross the border and carry messages, they could carry weapons, they could carry contraband of all different types. And out of a sense of decency, usually, not always, out of a sense of decency, men would just assume that they were women in search of husbands or mothers in search of their sons, that it would be inappropriate to subject these women to searches, and so they could win the sympathies of men on the opposing side. And so, of course, they assumed these are women. They could not possibly be involved in any kind of military intrigue. One of the most famous of these female spies was a Southern woman named Rose Greenhow. Now, Rose Greenhow was famous in Washington, D.C. She lived in Washington, D.C. She was famous for holding social gatherings where she would entertain important Union politicians in her home. She entertained and socialized with men who were in the Lincoln administration. And by having parties and by talking and chatting and doing sort of the things that women do when they gossip at parties, she got a lot of important military information. And she passed it on. In fact, she got a lot of important information about the preparations for the first battle of the Civil War at Bull Run. She passed that information on to the Confederate military officials and helped them to win that first key battle. So, in a sense, what Greenhow did was, again, didn't hide the fact that she was a woman. She seemed to do exactly what women always do. She had a party. She had a few parties. She chatted it up with her guests. She gossiped. There's no suspicion, really, that's aroused by doing that. But, in fact, she was getting military secrets. Other Southern women got involved in the war by joining ladies' aid societies. They made supplies for the troops. A few, as we'll talk about, became nurses to tend to the wounded in their homes and their hospitals. But this, and here I would like to make another point about Southern white women, not only did they feel important, not only did they feel frustrated, but many Southern white women felt constrained about acting boldly because the ideals of the South emphasized that women were weak, that they were subordinate, that they needed to be protected, and that it was important to always be genteel and ladylike. And I think that that idea of having to act like a lady was a critical constraint that many Southern white women felt in the course of the war. Because, in fact, Southern white women often found that if they were too bold, too aggressive, too outspoken, they could be publicly ridiculed and humiliated. And they didn't like that when that happened. So a point to illustrate this can be seen in the conflict that emerged sort of at a midway point in the war, a conflict that emerged between the women of New Orleans and the Union general in charge of occupied New Orleans, who was Benjamin Butler. In April of 1862, Union troops invaded New Orleans. They occupied the city, and they were able to bring it under the control of the Union Army. And the Union general who was in charge of that occupation, as I said, was Benjamin Butler. So from the start of the occupation, Benjamin Butler had trouble with the local women in New Orleans. The ladies of New Orleans did not like having Union soldiers in their midst. So they would make faces at them. They would spit at Union soldiers when they saw them on the street. They would refuse to sit in church next to them if they were anywhere in that church, or sit on a streetcar with them. If they saw them, on one side of the street, they'd make a kind of public show of crossing over to the other side of the street. And one woman in particular dumped her chamber pot on the head of Union Navy Admiral Farragut. Okay, so at this point, Benjamin Butler said, no, enough of that. And he issued something that was called the Woman Order. Okay, here's the Woman Order. Can I get somebody to read the Woman Order?
When any female shall, by word, gesture, or movement, insult or show contempt for any officer or soldiers of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation.
Okay. What does that mean? Guessing. Any guesses? What does it mean to be a woman of the town plying her avocation?
Is it an insinuation of prostitution?
It is. It's pretty direct. Yeah. Insinuation is one nice way of saying it. Yes, it means she's a prostitute. It means she's acting like a prostitute if this is what she does. So in other words, the implication here was that women who made a spectacle of themselves in public, who did these kind of obvious demonstrations against the soldiers, were really no better than prostitutes. Benjamin Butler, again, keep in mind he is the Union general, but we'll explain this. He's saying, okay, sure, women write letters, they stay home, they sew uniforms, but New Orleans women, he was saying, went beyond the line. They went beyond the line for what it was acceptable for refined women to do. And Benjamin Butler is in effect saying, you Southerners go on and on and on about how refined your ladies are. Well, BS, because this is not very refined. This is not very ladylike. I think that this whole idea of Southern women as ladies is really a myth, is what he's saying. And in fact, it's true that most women in New Orleans did not want to face the humiliation associated with Benjamin Butler's Woman's Order. So they stopped spitting at soldiers, they stopped making faces, they stopped dumping chamber pots on people's heads. And in a sense, I think the Woman Order recognized this kind of delicate balancing act that was embedded in the gender relations in the South, especially in a time of war. Because if Southern women wanted to be refined ladies, well, Butler was basically exposing that they had strayed from that idea. And by exposing that, he was going to use that idea, that kind of ideal that they want to live by, and use it to control their outbursts. And so, in fact, here was a cartoon that ran, I think it was in Frank Leslie's, it was in some magazine in the North, right after Benjamin Butler's Woman's Order was introduced and implemented. And so you can see we have on this side the ladies of New Orleans before General Butler's proclamation. That's quite a spit. That's a bullseye spit if I ever saw one. So that's before General Butler's proclamation, and here they are after General Butler's proclamation. Right? The implication being they're nasty spitting prostitutes before, and now we've brought them under control. So this sense, well, I guess so the other thing I would say is that the Woman Order really, in a sense, was a kind of disturbing reminder I'm not applauding General Butler by any means. The woman order, in a sense, was a disturbing reminder that even though these lines about, what's proper for women to do was being crossed in a time of war, that women would not move completely out of positions of subordination. The need that many women felt to be refined ladies also influenced whether Southern women decided to become nurses. In fact, many Southern white women did not become nurses. They disliked the idea of being nurses. They disliked the idea that there might be any untoward, unsavory contact between themselves and lower-class men who were soldiers in the Army. They believed, as one woman put it, that it would, quote, be injurious to the delicacy and refinement of a lady to be a nurse in a hospital. And so they said, okay, well, maybe we'll nurse sometimes when there was an emergency, if a wounded soldier was near our homes, or if our own relatives, if our husband was wounded, certainly we would help him out. But very few Southern white women actually made it a real occupation, especially when it meant being involved in taking care of strange men. In general, they believed that kind of work was the hard work that slave women did. Laundry, tending wounds, feeding somebody, that's the kind of work that slave women did. And in fact, throughout the war, the Confederacy found it hard to get white women to commit to nursing. And throughout the war, they suffered from a serious shortage of female nurses. All right, and I think I'm at the end of my time, so we'll talk more about this theme about what Southern white women could and could not do. We'll talk more about what Northern women do and do not do in the course of the war. I'll send you an email about the paper submissions, and I'll see you on Thursday.